Good day. Let me welcome our audience and especially our guest today, Ambassador Jack Matlock, who is one of those outstanding time witnesses who have been in crucial positions at key branching points in history, namely the end of the Cold War, since you were the ambassador of the United States in Moscow at that time and participated in many of the crucial discussions, which really laid the basis for an incredible chance in history, which, in my view, and I think you share that to a certain extent, was lost. But before we come to this period, which is very relevant for what is happening today, let us start in hearing what you may think about the turmoil which is taking place on the financial markets right now as a reaction to the measures by President Trump, who has put tariffs on every country on their imports from every country on the planet. And it seems chaos developing, and I think there are very few people right now in the whole world, including in governments, who have any idea where this is going to. So do you think that President Trump has a clear-cut plan, and does he have a clear idea how to execute that to reach whatever his goal may be?
Thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion. No, I think that President Trump has completely deluded in the way he's proceeding to use the tariffs. I think that he's proceeding from the incorrect assumptions, and the advisor that is principally urging him to do this thinks it will bring back widespread manufacturing to the United States. I think that is probably not going to happen, and instead it is disrupting much of the world's trade, and the extent of these are now putting much of the economy in turmoil. Our stocks now have been decreasing the value of them for the last 4 or 5 days. And the stock market just opened recently today here, and they're continuing their downward slide. So I don't think this is going to work, and probably the effects are going to be felt not only by the countries to which it's directed, but by the Americans and our consumers. So I think these policies are bad for everybody. Now, some say he only wants to negotiate lower tariffs and more trade. Well, we'll see. But the extent of these, I think, are so totally unreasonable that they're going to hurt a lot of people. So that I think that you're going to see in the United States increasing opposition to them. Now, the average consumer, it may be a few months before they feel it, but certainly some of our workers, like automobile factories, are already laying off workers because of the tariffs on parts and others that would be coming in. So I think we'll see, but certainly these have been, I would say, a very destructive force so far.
Well, it seems that this is already affecting the financial markets a lot. For example, many banks are starting to unwind their derivative positions. And, I think given the fact that the transatlantic financial system is so over indebted, and that you have a derivative exposure of what some experts are estimating $2 quadrillion in outstanding derivative contracts. So once we start to, go into this, we could see a real big financial crash. Now, that is my question, because I think, if Trump, let's say he wants to undo globalization, and there could be made some arguments that there is a legitimate reason, because the globalization as it has developed over the last decades has made the very rich, more billionaires, more millionaires, and many, many poor, more poor all over the world. So that a correction of the system is, desirable, one could argue. But my biggest concern is that, you just can't do things like bullying all over the world, pushing people, I mean, it may be Trump's famous style, but I think the proper way to have done it would have been to call in a big international economic conference, like a new Bretton Woods conference, and then, discuss the principles of how this reorganization should be done, and then put the details to a task force and expert groups and work it all out in a goodwill cooperation. But that doesn't seem to be what Trump is up to. What do you think?
No, that is definitely not Trump's style. And as I said, I think this is going to backfire. And about how soon he'll be forced to change, if he is forced to change, we simply don't know. So I think there are a lot of uncertainties ahead. But certainly his style is one to shake things up and to show that he's the one in charge. He is clearly an authoritarian type leader. And because of our, I would say, very convoluted politics over the last actually a decade or more in the United States, he did win the election. But the fact is that neither of our political parties gave us a candidate who was dedicated to peace. And I think that peace is important for us and for the entire world. And instead of continuing to fuel wars in various places, we should have been trying to dampen them down. We'll have to see how these various things work out. But certainly on the economic front, we should remember, we Americans, that we are now running a debt deficit of more than $36 trillion. And how much longer the dollar can retain its value with such a heavy debt load, and given Trump's plans to cut taxes, and the fact that inflation is going to continue, I see that the U.S. debt may continue to rise. It's already much too high. So that, I think, is something that is waiting to bring not only the United States, but the world into an economic recession and crisis of sorts.
Well, when President Trump came in, many people were extremely hopeful that when he started to make signs that he wants to normalize relations with Russia, that this was the most important, because it was like at the end of the previous administration, we had come dangerously close to a real escalation because of the long-range missiles into the territory of Russia and so forth. We were sitting on a volcano. So in the beginning, it looked like, that Trump is serious about having peace with Russia. I mean, that's naturally not to be done in 24 hours and maybe not even in weeks, but there was a chance. Now, I think that chance still exists, but in the meantime, many other things have complicated the picture. For example, Trump had promised not only to end all wars, but not to start new ones. And he started the bombing campaign against Yemen. There is still the dark cloud of what will happen with Iran. So I would like to hear what your thoughts are about that, and the fact that the Europeans, at least some of the Europeans, not all of them, but the Northern Europeans, want to form a so-called coalition of the willing to keep the war in Ukraine going, which is unbelievable. I mean, they're building tanks again in Germany by VW to send them against Russia. I mean, this is only 80 years after the end of the Second World War. So I think we have never seen a world picture, at least in my lifetime, which was so, complicated and fraught with hopes and dangers. But, don't you think that Trump should be encouraged to go ahead with this peace with Russia? Because I think that is the most important element in the whole picture.
Yes, I do think it's very important for Europe and the United States, and most of all Ukraine, that there be an end to this war and a settlement that will bring some stability. And I think the increasing armaments in Western Europe are almost tragic, and because they're, first of all, unnecessary. Russia does not threaten the countries that are now in NATO. And the problem has been we have been treating a very, I would say, unrepresentative government in Ukraine as if it were a NATO member, which has been a red line for Russia for decades. Now, and yet what we have done in bringing arms in, we and our European allies, and is the most we would be required to do if they were a NATO member. And the Russian leader has been making it clear for over 20 years that there's an absolute red line in bringing Western armaments into Ukraine, or I would say Belarus. Frankly, we should understand that, because our own countries, particularly the United States, would not tolerate armed bases on countries next to it, Mexico or Canada or in the Caribbean, but armed by some foreign power. So I think that to say that the war in Ukraine was unprovoked is simply a misrepresentation of the facts. And now, in order to settle it, it cannot be settled by a establishment of borders that were created by Stalin and Hitler. We should not forget that these borders, in bringing what is now Western Ukraine and uniting it with Ukraine, was a creation of Stalin and Hitler. And why we want to have Ukrainians die and have their country destroyed in order to defend the heritage of Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler beggars the mind. I just do not see it, and I can't understand how both the United States and our European allies have been such victim of such a delusion that somehow Ukraine is entitled to all of those borders, regardless of what it does in regard to its very large minority of Russian speakers. Because what happened over time was that they took away the cultural rights of these people, and let's face it, much of the violence has been created by neo-Nazis that have all of the symbols and have now put up monuments to some of the worst war criminals during World War II, involved in the execution of Jewish inhabitants in what was then Eastern Poland, but is now Western Ukraine. So it seems that European policies are myopic in that, historically myopic, and you forget the history of these problems. And second, tunnel vision, because in looking at the past to the extent we do, you forget much of the relevant facts.
Well, I find it hardly to understand how history forgotten. I don't know if that's the right English word. How much the Europeans have indeed totally shrugged off the memory of the history of 80 years ago. You said that Russia does not have the intent to conquer other European countries, which is right now the big narrative why this militarization is being promoted. They don't have the capacity to conquer the rest of Europe, and I don't think they have the intention, because Russia has turned away from Europe and towards Asia, towards the BRICS. So I cannot see even a motive, and I don't see the capability for them to attack. Nevertheless, this is the narrative. And there has now been a very important development, which I think bears on that, and that is the fact that the New York Times, a couple of days ago, maybe a week ago, had a 13,000 word long article, which was an investigation they did over 1 year. They interviewed 300 people from many countries. And the short and the long of it is that they basically admit that from mid-April 22 onward, the entire Ukraine war was commanded, carried out, advised, technically assisted, and so forth from Wiesbaden, from the U.S. headquarters for Europe and Africa. And, they brought Ukrainian top leaders, military leaders in plain clothes to Wiesbaden in mid-April 22. And then they describe in the article in great detail that practically the entire war was conducted by the Americans from Wiesbaden, and that the Ukrainians really had a very subordinated role, basically being the cannon fodder for this operation. Now, this is, I think, a very important admission, because, the whole narrative of NATO right now and these Northern Europeans is, that this was an unprovoked war of aggression, that, even if a journalist or some commentator would doubt that, you are at this point in Europe in danger that you will be fined if you even question that narrative. And if you say that there was a prehistory to it, going back to the NATO extensions, and you mentioned, that de facto we have a reversed Cuban Missile Crisis because all of these offensive systems are very close to the Russian border. Some of these systems have a warning time of maybe 6 minutes to Moscow. So, anybody who would look objectively at the situation would say it was not unprovoked. So what do you think is the consequence of this New York Times article? I mean, they still, in my view, have a certain amount of cover story, because they say, the Americans did everything right. It was just that the Ukrainians didn't obey the orders of the Americans properly, and that's why the war was lost. So I don't think that quite fits the story also. But in my view, my sense of justice and sense that, if you don't reintroduce truth in this debate, we cannot find a solution. Don't you think it would be appropriate that all the journalists, all the politicians who kept repeating the narrative of the unprovoked war of aggression would basically make an apology and say that at best they were in error?
Well, of course, there should be an apology, but I'm sure there will not be. We might say our foreign policy elite are those concentrated in Washington and many in think tanks financed by our weapons manufacturers have actually constructed a completely false narrative, I believe, of the situation. And what has happened is, although they're telling the American people that, well, we must defend Ukraine, this is a poor, innocent, democratic country that's been invaded by bad old Russia. Well, Ukraine has been invaded by Russia, that is true. But that invasion has not been as complete as the American invasion of Iraq. back in the second Bush administration, when Iraq was no threat to the United States whatsoever. And the United States took many of its NATO allies in that. So there is a precedent of the United States carrying out an aggressive war without provocation. And now the United States is accusing Russia of an aggressive war, ignoring the fact that the provocation was there. President Putin began warning in a speech in 2007 in Munich at the Wehrkunde conference. The things that were happening that were, I would say, stressing the peace with Russia. Most of these were based upon the expansion of NATO, and not only the expansion of NATO, but the placing of military bases in the East European countries close to Russia. Russia had been signaling ever since the 90s that that was unacceptable. And we forget that when Vladimir Putin came to office, he not only straightened out Russia's economy to the degree it had been virtually bankrupt, he brought them back into productivity, and they paid off the foreign debts of the Soviet Union and Russia in about 3 to 4 years. And he brought some regularity into the Russian economic system, so that at that time he was considered himself an ally of the West and trying to bring Russia into the West. And repeatedly the efforts to create a security system that would include Russia as well as the other countries was simply ignored by the Western countries and the United States. Instead, there seemed to be an effort to pull away former parts of the Soviet Union, parts that were legally in the Soviet Union, like Georgia and particularly Ukraine, from Russian influence. And that, for obvious reasons, was unacceptable. But the idea that somehow Russia is always aggressive forgets the fact that it was actually the Russian leader that broke up the Soviet Union. After all, it was Boris Yeltsin's meetings with the leaders of Belarus and Ukraine that brought down the Soviet Union. That was not a victory for the West, and that was not when the Cold War ended. The Cold War ended earlier, and the United States at that time, during the first Bush administration, did not want the rest of the Soviet Union to fall apart. We had always wanted the 3 Baltic states to regain their independence. We never recognized that they were legally part of the Soviet Union. The other 12 republics we did recognize were legally there. And as the first President Bush told the Ukrainian parliament in 1991, asked them to avoid suicidal nationalism. And yet that suicidal nationalism, the sort that had earlier affected Georgia and brought war there, began to be dominant in Ukraine. And this is simply ignored by those who now argue that, we must defeat Putin or else he'll be a threat to others. I don't like what Putin has done internally. I certainly don't like the invasion. But as one who warned from the late 90s not to expand NATO, and particularly not to put bases there in Eastern Europe without security guarantees to Russia, would be catastrophic. Almost all of us who negotiated the end of the Cold War made that clear when the question was being debated in the United States. And it is a tragedy that our prediction now has been brought about. I'll make another point, that we and our West European friends are destroying Ukraine in this process in an attempt simply to weaken Russia. We all need Russia to cooperate in what are the great challenges at the present and the future. The ravages of environmental degradation, and we see every day more fires, floods, and so on. And yet these wars are preventing us from really dealing with the climate change. They're bringing about even more massive migrations, which are stress to all of our countries. And instead of uniting to try to deal with them, we are fueling fights, not only in Ukraine, but even worse in the Middle East, where we are tolerating a genocidal policy that Israel is following regarding Gaza and increasingly the West Bank. And the coverage of these in our principal media are simply heavily biased.
Well, I thank you for your voice of humanity, which you expressed so clearly. I mean, what is your explanation? Why? I mean, I can only say that the speeches given by Putin repeatedly when Clinton visited Moscow, I think in 2000, and when Putin spoke to the German Bundestag in 2001, he even spoke in part in German. He quoted all the German poets and, expressed a very warm attitude towards Germany, which I think was very remarkable, given the fact that Germany, after all, had a leading role in the Second World War, killing 27 million Russians, which is still very, very actual in the mind of the people talking about the Great Patriotic War. So I thought that the Russian behavior in the time of the German unification and even afterwards was extremely generous. I mean, they admitted, they agreed to let Germany be part of NATO, if there would be no extension of NATO to the east. And, what I'm really struggling with is how can my contemporary Germans, how can they be so negligent and ignorant and indifferent to German history? Because we should be grateful to Russia that we had this peaceful revolution, which was historically a tremendous chance. We could have had a peace order. We could have moved in a completely different era of human civilization. And I'm still struggling with the idea, why do they hate the Russians so much, or some people do, that they bring about the potential destruction of all of civilization rather than admitting that they were erroneous?
Well, I think you're quite right in many respects. I was present when our Secretary of State repeatedly assured President Gorbachev and the Soviet foreign minister that if they agreed to the unification of the then two German states and unification on terms that had been set by West Germany, that is simply absorb the German Democratic Republic into the West German constitution. In other words, the East German Länder would simply become part of Germany. The Soviet position earlier was that there had to be negotiation between the two states. But events within East Germany made that impossible when in the elections in February, I think it was 90, brought the CDU the plurality of votes in the German Democratic Republic. In any event, there was an agreement then that when Germany was united, that although there was nothing about NATO expansion in the agreements, there was a provision that there could be no foreign troops or nuclear weapons in what had been the territory of the German Democratic Republic. Now, actually, the assurances given by the American Secretary of State and the German Foreign Minister, and I understand the British Prime Minister at that time, was there would be no NATO expansion to the east, and as Secretary Baker said at one point, not 1 inch. And that he was talking about the territory of the German Democratic Republic at that time. But obviously, this would have implied to Eastern Europe. They weren't talking about Eastern Europe because at that time there was still a Warsaw Pact. And there was never any thought that we would be expanding it further. The talks were about East Germany. And then the treaty did prohibit any foreign bases. So by later, when we began to expand NATO, President Putin at that time did not object to the first expansion. He did not even object to the expansion to the 3 Baltic states. When that was being discussed, he came to New York and made a speech at Columbia University. I was teaching there then, and I asked him directly in a public meeting what his position was on inclusion of the 3 Baltic countries into NATO. He said he thought that was unnecessary, but he would not oppose it so long as there were no foreign bases there. And so what we ignore when we say that, it's just NATO expansion, it is NATO expansion plus foreign bases. And we mustn't forget that the anti-ballistic missile bases that were later established in Poland and Romania used missiles that by a change of software could have been offensive. So there is a good solid reason for President Putin to have opposed this. So yes, the current war in Ukraine is an utter tragedy, most of all for Ukraine, but also for Russia, because it is going to create for generations hostility between the 2 countries. But the fact is, for the peace of Europe, you're going to have a settlement on a basis other than a total restoration of the borders that Hitler, Stalin, and in the case of Crimea, Khrushchev created. And so that, I think, is the fact, and why that isn't understood more widely in Europe, and in particularly in Germany, it's hard for me to understand.
Well, the head of state of Georgia just basically said, that he thinks that the Europeans are now a deep state, or they're in affinity with the deep state in the United States, what people call the deep state. So, I think it's geopolitics. I think it's the British Empire. If you look at people think that the British Empire has vanished or is no longer existent, but I think it exists in a different form. First, you have the Commonwealth, you have the Five Eyes, and then the financial powers in Wall Street and the City of London, which are sort of the extension of the British Empire, because they control much of the conditions of credit and trade and so forth. But I think that if you look at the role of the British in this conflict, they have been instigating again and again Keir Starmer came to Washington in the late phase of the Biden administration, egging him on, to use the long-range missiles into the territory of Russia. So can you say how you see the role of the British in the Anglo-American special relationship?
Well, I think you have correctly diagnosed it as a sort of empire nostalgia, and thus casting Russia as you might say, an eternal enemy, because there was a contest. Yeah, of course, the Crimean War, then the contest over control of Afghanistan, which goes back to the 19th century, and so on. And so that yes, I think that in many minds, the Americans have become, in effect, the enforcers for reestablishing a sort of British Empire inspired by the same attitudes. But I don't think this is in the interest of the people in the United Kingdom. And again, I think that both of our governments, we also shouldn't forget that the aggressive invasion of Iraq, which the second Bush administration carried out based upon false evidence, which they knew was false when we look back. And who were our main allies in that? Well, the British. So that, again, I don't think this is really in the interest of the British people. But you have maybe the many of the emotion and thoughts of empire that, and particularly places like Crimea, which of course in the 19th century was attacked by the British. By the way, the great writer Leo Tolstoy, later a pacifist, was actually a Russian artillery officer in the defense of Crimea during the Crimean War. So many of these things that today who are fighting over for emotionally for Russians are a very integral part of their own history. And so one of the things the West Europeans and Americans should understand is this conflict is largely a civil war among East Slavs as to who control what and where they're oriented. And like other civil wars, the interference of others simply exacerbates it. And this could have been settled without a total war if the two Minsk Accords had been observed. But they were, that violation was by the signatories, France and Germany. You hear now, oh, you can't trust Vladimir Putin. If you actually look at what he said and what others have said, these, I would say, France and Germany have broken more agreements than he has. Everybody has broken some. But in this case, I think we have seen an attempt to trim down Russia and to limit its influence. And of course, it is weaker than the United States. But the fact is that in trying, as our former Secretary of Defense said, to weaken Russia, we actually are doing more to divide the world and to create, I'd say, larger problems for ourselves and for all of humanity.
Well, I think that the United States is also in a crisis because, at the Bandung conference, this was the first Asia-African conference of the non-aligned movement. President Sukarno and Nero, they were discussing actually, that the War of Independence of the United States was the first anti-colonial war of any country. And, I think, if the people of the United States could simply go back to look at their own history, look what was the intention of the American Republic, of Benjamin Franklin, of the founding fathers, of John Quincy Adams, who famously said, it's not the purpose of the United States to go abroad and look for foreign monsters. The American system of economy was set up by Alexander Hamilton. And this was actually, a time where many people around the world looked up at the American Revolution as a branching point in history, because it was, Europe was still under the control of monarchies and oligarchies, and the American Republic was meant to be a republic, devoted to the common good, not only of the present people, but of future generations, as it is said in the preamble of the Constitution. Then you have the Declaration of Independence, and when I founded the Schiller Institute 41 years ago, I was looking, what document could be the basis for the, Constitution of the Schiller Institute. And I then thought that the most closest to the ideas of what this was supposed to accomplish was the Declaration of Independence. So I changed only 6 words, like where it says American colony, I said developing countries. Where it says the colonial masters, I say the financial credit systems or the financial control of the system. So by just changing 5-6 words, I made it applicable for the whole world, because I wanted the Americans to remind themselves of their own proud tradition, and I wanted the Americans also to see that other countries have the same right like them have, and that the other countries see what is the better genius of the United States. So, I mean, what in your view would be necessary to revive that proud tradition of America and reject the British Empire grip?
Well, I think that at the end of the Cold War, we, Americans and our West European allies, simply adopted a false doctrine. We seem to have adopted, with minor changes, the former Soviet idea that communism was going to sweep the world by revolution, and that therefore it was their historic duty to support revolutions in various countries. Well, of course, the fact was that these revolutions did not produce the socialism that Marx had described. They produced totalitarian systems. But there was another assumption there, that if you were what they called socialist, that is dominated by the Soviet Union, they would be friends. And of course, in Eastern Europe, this was a matter of Soviet domination. But then other countries that were Marxist, like Yugoslavia, Albania pulled away, China pulled away under Mao Zedong, so that actually this idea that this was going to be the future of the world was simply incorrect. Now, after as the Soviet Union was breaking up, we had our philosophers saying this was the end of history, and following sort of a distortion of Hegel, that this time it was going to be democracy and capitalism that was going to sweep the world, and that it was the duty of the United States as the principal democratic and capitalist country to spread democracy in the rest of the world. Now, there's several things wrong with that. One thing, it is certainly not true necessarily that simply because you've got the same form of government, you're going to be friends. Whether you're friends or not depends on a lot of things. And the second is that one country cannot create democracy in another. If democracy is, as Abraham Lincoln said at one point, government of, by, and for the people, then how can another person create it? In fact, if other countries get involved in the internal politics of they're apt to do more harm to the people they wish than that. And you quoted John Quincy Adams in quite aptly, because when he warned against and said America goes not abroad seeking monsters to destroy, he also said in his very flowery language that if the United States gets involved in disputes in Europe and backing one side or the other in these disputes, America itself will become an empire. And he warned against it. And now what we have is a president who very much admires President McKinley, which was in the United States turned into an openly imperialistic mode. American foreign policy has vacillated, and it has vacillated in a number of different ways. But when we began to expand outside North America, then it was under McKinley, and and McKinley seems to be the idol of President Trump. He often quotes him. He even wanted to rename the highest mountain in Alaska, Mount McKinley again, instead of Denali, which had been its original name of the people there. And so this is one of our problems, that Trump seems to want to go back to a period which is actually was proven to be not very successful in the long run. But I would say that American policy does vacillate. It always has. It has not been a straight line by any means. And I think that what we're going to see is in many ways a failure of the current policy, and certainly the current belligerent way that tariffs are being used, and we're continuing to fuel wars in the Middle East and give the arms for what is clearly a genocidal war against Gaza, and so on. So I think that many things are happening now that are not going to work out well. But I would also say that there can be unexpected turns fairly quickly. When I was advising, President Reagan on how to end the Cold War, we took what had been a very tense situation, and within 3 years, we turned it around. And so I think that unexpected things can happen. But one thing I would say is that the idea that there is going to be a future in trying to divide the world between East and West, and to use military means is, I think, going to be disastrous for everybody. And the sooner we come off that, the better off everybody is going to be.
Well, I believe since a long time that we have reached a point in human history where we have to make a new chapter, like the new time, a new paradigm, which must be as different like the modern times was from the Middle Ages. I mean, if you think about the 14th century, which was the Black Death, you had a superstition, witchcraft belief. The peripatetics were debating how many angels can sit on a pin. It was really one outlook which was very backward. And then came the Italian Renaissance, And you had the beginning of the modern time, urbanization played a bigger role. The role of the individual became more distinct. The role of science and technology to improve the living standard of people became a factor. You had book printing, and the modern times had very different axioms in what people were thinking about the image of man, the nature of the universe. And I think we have reached a point in history where we have to really think about a new paradigm, leave behind us imperialism, oligarchism, greediness of this unrestricted type we experience today, and really think of what puts us as one humanity on a completely different plane. Because, from all the creatures known in the universe, on the planet, but also on the universe, the human species is the only creative species. We can again and again come up with solutions to solve problems. We can make scientific discoveries which completely changes the mode of living, improving life expectancy, living standard of more and more people. And I think we are really challenged now to give ourselves an order which allows the survival of all nations on the planet, taking into account the interest of every nation on the planet, sort of like the Peace of Westphalia did that as the first time, to really think you have to consider everybody's interest, or else nobody's interest is taken care of. And I hope that some leading people in the world would come up with the idea of creating a new paradigm, a new security and development architecture, which does exactly that. So if you would be so kind to tell me what you think about such an idea.
Well, I think you're right that we need to find a way to a world system that will tolerate different cultures. We have to recognize that as important as some of the ideas of you might say the Western Renaissance and development of international law, that there were other periods, like during the Dark Ages in Western Europe. Byzantium was in the East was much more successful. Also, in the early Middle Ages, many aspects of Muslim society, particularly that in Spain, was, I would say, more liberal and more perceptive than the prevailing Western ideas. So the idea that somehow the rise of Europe and what for a time was the domination of the rest of the world was a temporary condition, and it carried with it the burden of implicit racialism, a domination of colonies elsewhere. We're still seeing developments beyond that. But I think today, when we worry about, say, Chinese influence, I look out and it seems that influence is being brought about by Chinese economic policies, by Chinese investment and sales in various countries. China, so far as I know, has no military bases outside its borders except some of these disputed islands there. Whereas the United States has over 80 bases in over 80 countries. Now, it seems to me that to talk about, a Chinese military threat is ridiculous. Now, of course, China has not excluded using force against Taiwan, but God forbid that we get into a war over that. Actually, if that should happen, it is not at all clear that China would not prevail. And I think today the idea that excluding export of things like advanced chips is going to bring about a situation where China simply leapfrogs the United States in some of these technology areas. And I think there's been sort of a blindness to this. But behind much of this has been the force in the United States of what I call the military, industrial, and congressional complex. The idea that somehow you've got to find peer competitors in order to finance a bigger and bigger so-called defense budget, a defense which has become increasingly offense. I don't think that's in the interest of the American people, and I don't think that's in the interest of the rest of the world.
Well, Ambassador, this is really a breath of fresh air to listen to you because, you know, I mean, I'm talking mostly to Europeans these days, and what you are saying is so much more reasonable and you know, enlightened. Would you be so kind to tell our audience in the end your warning, or, you know, if you look at Ursula von der Leyen, and now we have a new government in Germany, Merz, and they all want to militarize, they want to make Germany kriegstüchtig, you know, war ready. Can you, based on your experience, tell the Germans and the Europeans how they should change their thinking about these matters?
Well, I think that Germany, and in particular, but also the rest of the Europe, is not going to be able to fulfill its full potential without cooperation with Russia and the East. Russia simply is too large. It contains so many resources, and of course, it has a culture which is European and one of the most important cultures for Europe. You know, and it seems to me that Germany can never flourish if it is cut off from Russia. After all, the whole matter of energy imports, they're going to be cheaper from Russia. And German industry very much depends upon that. These current tariffs and so on from the United States, I think if they are continued, are going to be really disastrous. And to act as if Russia is a threat to Germany, I think is simply a very dangerous delusion.
Well, thank you so much. Let me express my thankfulness to you, and, you know, spontaneously tell you that you are a fantastic human being, and I hope you give us the joy again in the future. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the compliments and for the privilege of being on your show.
Till very soon.